belonging to a family just because you were lucky enough to win the genetic lottery isn't enough. You actually have to stand for something. And if you don't stand for something, you're imperiling the entire project. So if you think about it, of the children of Jacob, who are the inheritors of this incredible wealth that Abraham built, which of them becomes by far the wealthiest? Joseph, the one who's sent away, the one who's entrepreneurial, the one who actually builds something new. When I think of people that I have just tremendous admiration for, whether they be people that I met or that were alive during my lifetime, or figures of the past that we all look up to.
Wooden rackety chair. That's what you're thinking they're sitting on, right?
Exactly.
They're not sitting on a couch. They had the same table for the last 35 years.
It's always someone riding on a donkey.
Right.
It's important to break down, like, what do we admire? I think what we admire is not the poverty. I think what we admire is the sacrifice. I think what we admire is the ability to hold firm to a value system and a mission statement and a sense of godliness despite the circumstances that you're in.
Does God want you to be rich? What does the Torah, the Bible, really say about money? In this conversation, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm challenges everything you thought you knew about wealth and purpose from the Bible's perspective, from Avram's entrepreneurial journey to the deeper meaning of generational wealth. This episode is going to redefine your understanding of money. Let's dig in. Being a Jew, awesome. Managing personal finances, not so awesome. Welcome to Kosher Money. We're here with Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm. Came in from over an hour away. He's here, and we're going to be talking about the Bible, Torah, and money. So the first question right off the bat is, when you look in the Torah, what is the Torah's view on money?
This is always a very personal question for me. So I remember before I decided to go into Rabbanus, it was between Rabbanus and law or something like that. So I went to my grandfather of blessed memory, my teacher, Rabbi Norman Lamm, and I asked him, I said, I'd love to ask you for career advice. And he said, very simple, whatever you do, don't become a rabbi. I said, well, this is a quick conversation then. So, usually when people ask what is the Torah's view on money, they have one of two things in mind, or one of three things in mind. The first is like literal money. What does the Torah have to say about coinage, right? Currency. You could talk about the idea of a shekel, what role that plays in Jewish thought. There are other types of currency the Bible mentions. The second thing people usually have in mind is, what does the Torah think about economic, monetary commandments? So, not to take interest or to have honest weights and measurements. And the third thing that people have in mind is, what does the Torah think about the economy in general? Sort of like, how do we avoid moral issues in the marketplace, to quote the name of a very wonderful book by Rabbi Aaron Levine, one of the great Jewish kind of economic thinkers of the last century. There are always questions, typically when they're asked, that are trying to pin down a negative, right? So what brakes does the Torah put on economic processes? And I think those are important questions to ask. They're very important questions to ask. And the Bible spends a great deal of time talking about all the sorts of prohibitions that we have upon how we're supposed to engage, all the commandments that we have about how we're supposed to be honest, et cetera. And those are all extremely crucial. One thing I almost never hear anybody ask about is, what is the Torah's view on the role of economic growth? Why is that important? Because that's actually a positive vision for what finance and money can do. And you almost never hear that conversation in popular writing about Jewish views on money. So just to take, a small example, you could take some of the many Sfarim that have been published over the last, just 10 years alone, both in English and in Hebrew, and I'm sure in other languages. And if you go through the glossary, or if you do a search on Hebrew books or Otzar HaChachma, some of the search engines for Jewish literature, of those books, you will not find the word growth in any of them. It's like wild to think about. So why is this important? Because as far as we human beings know, one of the greatest phenomena that humanity has ever discovered for bringing happiness to human beings and for unleashing the sorts of prosperity that we as Ovdei Hashem, as aspiring servants of God, value, economic growth is one of the greatest of them. So just to give like a really quick kind of like philosophical thought experiment. So one of my favorite thinkers, Tyler Cowen, he's an economist at George Mason University, but he's also excellent on Twitter. He has a concept called the Crusonia plant. Crusonia plant is named after the book Robinson Crusoe, about the guy who gets stranded on a desert island and how does he survive? Well, all the plants there just like produce food for free. He doesn't have to till the soil, and the seeds, pollinate with each other, etc. So Crusonia plant is like a plant that just produces, let's say, 5 apples a year automatically. So how valuable is a Crusonia plant versus anything else? So what Tyler Cowen says is that, if you compare a Crusonia plant versus a Ferrari, so maybe the Ferrari is more valuable. But let's say you have 5 years of Crusonia plant, 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years. At a certain point, just the sheer ability of the Crusonia plant to keep growing and to keep producing more trees and more trees and more trees is just going to overwhelm any other value. It's sort of like LeBron James. At a certain point, like just the sheer value you get from like a basically 30-year career is so overwhelming. So when we think about what we, for example, value as a Jewish community, so we value the ability to spend as much time as we can devoting ourselves to God through prayer, through study, through doing good deeds. How do we have the capacity to do those things? Because we can afford them. There's a reason why the ability to do that en masse is a modern phenomenon. So what does the Torah think about growth? What does the Torah think about dynamism in an economy? And the truth is, the Torah actually gives us its thoughts on that in the literal very beginning of the Bible. The first thing that we know about the human story, the literal very first thing we know about the human story, is the Bible tells us that God created man in his image. My grandfather, Rabbi Lamm, whom I mentioned earlier, has an awesome essay called The Religious Implications of Extraterrestrial Life. It's one of my favorite things he ever wrote. One of the points that he makes in that essay is that he asks, what do we know about God when we're told that man is created in God's image? What do we know about God? What does that even mean? The only thing we know about God is basically, there are 3 components. 1, God is a creator. 2, God makes moral judgments, right? And God saw that it was good, right? God makes moral judgments between good and evil, and God cares about humanity. So what does it mean for humanity to be created in God's image? It means that we care about other human beings. It means we make moral judgments, but first and foremost, we're creators. Mm-hmm. We create things. So technological creativity is the primary expression of the divine image. And you can see that immediately in the first story of the Bible. The first story of the Bible that humanity engages in is the Garden of Eden. We're used to thinking of that as a tragedy, and it is. Humans are given a commandment, they're unable or unwilling to abide by it, and they're expelled. So at the same time, when you think about life in the Garden of Eden, if you idealize it, it seems strange that if you compare it to the ideal that God sets out for the Israelites when they enter into the Promised Land, the ideals don't seem to match at all, right? The Garden of Eden, humanity is given food for free, animal companions for free, has only one commandment, and that's it. Whereas the Israelites in the land of Israel are given the task of working the land and of growing the land, and they have many commandments, and they have foreign policy, and they have domestic policy, and they have a functioning economy. So which one is the ideal? I think the answer is that the Bible actually tells us at the very beginning of the Garden of Eden story that this is an ideal, but it's not the ideal. What do I mean? So if you look in the beginning of Genesis, just to take like a very, very quick point, because my whole thing is reading the Bible in Hebrew.
You carry that around with you everywhere?
I do. This is my favorite book. It's the best book ever written.
Is that an autographed copy?
Yeah, right, exactly. God is the best-selling author of all time. I think number 2 is like J.K. Rowling, right? So if you look at the very beginning of the story of the Garden of Eden, the story begins before all the drama about giving human beings a command. It begins by saying in chapter 2, when every plant was not yet growing from the ground and all of the grass is not yet sprouted. Why is all of it not yet sprouted? You expect the Bible to say, because God has not sprouted it yet. And that is the next thing the Bible says in Hebrew, Ki lo himtir Hashem Elokim ala haaretz, because God has not yet brought the rain down onto the ground. But the second thing the verse says is Va'adam ayin lavodat adama, and there was no human being yet to work the ground. Well, hold on. Are human beings supposed to be working the ground? I thought they're in the Garden of Eden enjoying a carefree life. If you turn to the very end of the story, well, what you see happens is that humanity is in this idyllic existence, but then thrown out. And I think if you look at the way the story is structured, you can see that God both mourns this occasion, but also knows that it's inevitable and it's a good thing. How do I know that? Well, first of all, think about the analogy. The best analogy I could give for Gan Eden, for the Garden of Eden, is infancy. It's humanity when we're babies. So think about when you have a baby, right? When you have a child, I'm not even talking a toddler, although that's also a good analogy. But when you have a 6-month-old, it's simple, it's beautiful. They really just have to do one thing, sleep and eat. And there's something gorgeous and special about that moment in time, and you don't want it to end, right? And you eventually have a toddler. What do toddlers do? We call them the terrible twos for a reason, right? What toddlers do is they don't listen and they'll do dumb things. And it drives us crazy. And sometimes you even have to punish, like a 3-year-old, who can understand what's happening, or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who can understand what's happening. And ultimately, we as parents will be sad when that phase is over. There's something sweet and innocent about it that we'll always miss. But I don't think any of us as parents want our children to stay there forever. We don't want our children to suffer from arrested development. We want our children to actually flourish and grow up. And when they do grow up, they're going to make worse mistakes and they're going to make harder choices. But ultimately, what we want from them is to grow and mature as human beings. They'll never be our partners and friends. They'll always be our children, but they'll be the kind of people we can have a deeper relationship with. And God experiences that exact thing, kivyachol, or as it were, with human beings. God both mourns the fact that we can't stay infants forever, but ultimately God wants us to go out of the Garden of Eden. How do I know that? Because the Bible actually tells us 2 things about how human beings are sent away from the garden. At the very end of chapter 3, we're told, and God sent away human beings from the Garden of Eden to work the ground that they were taken from. And he sent away human beings and he put them to the east of the Garden of Eden. Why does it say he sent them away twice? The answer is, in Hebrew, the 2 words that are used for sent away are actually 2 different words. One word is shalach, which means to send, and one word is garash, which means to banish. In biblical Hebrew, garash is always a negative. It always means something bad. It, for example, means to banish a spouse from the home, right? Banishing is always bad, but sending is almost always good. When you send people away, you're sending them on a mission. Sometimes the mission can end poorly, like the scouts who are sent to scout out the land of Israel, and that ends in disaster. But it's always a positive mission, or it's almost always a positive mission. So when God sends human beings away from the garden, he's both punishing them because you've done something wrong and you've been banished, but he's also sending them because if you remember that first verse at the beginning of chapter 2, before the whole story with the serpent and Adam and Eve, God had always planned for humanity to go and work the ground. That was what the ground was waiting for. It was waiting for God to put rain on, but also for man to work the ground. God always knew we were going to leave. So what does that tell us about money? What does that tell us about the economy? Well, it tells us that fundamentally we are beings who are created in God's image. Our task is to create. Our task is to grow. Our task is to actually take the canvas that God has painted for us and in partnership with our master in heaven, with the author of all creation, we are meant to make it greater. So the great investor Peter Thiel has a wonderful phrase where he says, the beautiful thing about the Bible is that it begins with a garden and it ends with a city. And that actually is, I think, we could talk forever about, all the economic policies that the Torah has, and those are important. I'm sure we'll talk about them. But fundamentally, I think it's really important for us as Jews, for Americans as Americans, and for people who take the Jewish intellectual tradition seriously, as America has done since before the founding, to understand that fundamentally, the Bible's view, the Torah's view on money is that we should want a society that is flourishing and that is growth and creation oriented.
I ask one question and he delivers a beautiful speech on money and the Torah. We'll be right back, but when it comes to giving, it doesn't matter if you're donating $10 or $10 million. Everyone starts somewhere. Charity, tzedakah, is the greatest equalizer. It unites all of us in a shared purpose of helping others and uplifting our growing community. So, whether you're giving or receiving, we are ultimately one, connected by the values of generosity and compassion. And the Donor Fund believes that giving should be simple, meaningful, and strategic. That's why the Donors Fund provides tools to help you manage your charity smarter. It centralizes everything. So with the end of the year upon us, it's the perfect time to maximize your tax benefits while making a real impact. The Donors Fund helps you plan strategically. ensuring you claim a tax deduction for the year 2024 while giving yourself the flexibility to decide where your donations go later. How awesome. So by donating appreciated stock instead of cash, you can also avoid capital gains taxes and deduct the full fair market value of the stock, making your giving more tax efficient and impactful. Speak to your accountant. They know all these fancy words and they'll be like, hey, that's pretty cool. It includes personalized support, flexible donation options, and tools to maximize the impact of your charity. So whether you're donating to a local yeshiva, supporting Israel, God bless you, or planning legacy giving for your family, the Donors Fund helps you give with purpose. Take advantage of these significant tax benefits by setting up a donor-advised fund. Link is in the show notes. Set it up before December 31st. You could put your money in there, and that's a tax deduction. Do it. Take the time. It's very quick. You'll probably have an account in under 60 seconds. So whether you're just starting your journey of giving or managing a portfolio of charity, the Donors Fund is here to help. Visit thedonorsfund.org/koshermoney now and discover how you can make your giving more impactful for you, your family, and your community. The Donors Fund, giving smarter together. So as humanity grew, pun intended, past the Garden of Eden and starts to build, right, from Noah through the forefathers, we keep seeing property, materialism, money. I think with all the forefathers, it discusses this idea of wealth. So there's a few directions we're going to go in, but the first one I want to start, when you think about the forefathers and their relationships with money, what comes to mind? What lessons, what passes through your mind?
So if you look at the story of Avram, of Abraham, there's a key word that appears in that story many, many times. A good friend of mine, Michael Eisenberg, who's one of the leading VCs in Israel and is also an incredible scholar of Tanakh, pointed this out to me. The word rechush, which is the biblical Hebrew word for property or for wealth, it's a pretty rare word. It's a relatively rare word. It appears 28 times in Tanakh. 9 of those, almost a third, are in the book of Genesis, are in Bereshis. And of those 9, 7 of them are in the story of Abraham alone, in the story of Abraham alone. The story of Abraham is completely structured around wealth, where it comes from, how you get it, what to do with it once you have it, and how to avoid losing it, and the consequences for losing it. So for example, Abraham's story begins before Abraham. Abraham's actually not the one who makes the journey from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan. It's his father who does that, right? His father, Terah, or Terach in the Jewish pronunciation, is the one who takes his family from Ur of the Chaldeans, and moves them to Haran, to Haran.
Which is beautiful this time of year.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, by the way, and like what's the journey that Abraham takes? So life is journeys, right? The journey is from a place of incredible plenty to a place of seeming scarcity, right? Like Mesopotamia is the literal setting for the Garden of Eden. It's the most beautiful place in the world. ISIS ruined it, but it's the most beautiful place in the world, right? He goes from the actual setting of paradise to this like hilly country where you're lucky if rain comes, right? He then goes from Canaan, from that hilly country, to Egypt, the other most gorgeous place in the world. The Nile River is literally this like automatic economy engine, right? Like it's the craziest thing in the world. And then he goes from there back to Canaan, and he has all these. So the entire journey of Abraham is structured around wealth. We always hear about how Abraham is earning wealth, how Abraham loses his property and needs to go down to Egypt, how he emerges back from Egypt with renewed wealth, how he gains wealth from the spoils of the war between the 5 kings and the 4 kings, how he and Lot, his nephew, both earn wealth in different ways. So the whole story of Abraham is completely structured around wealth, the entire thing.
His purchase of his wife's.
Yeah. The whole thing is economics, right? The whole thing's economics. The whole thing is money. So what's the lesson we're supposed to learn? I think, in a nutshell, the story of Abraham is, on the one hand, a story of an entrepreneur, right? How does he improve upon his father's journey? His father journeys out of Mesopotamia. And what do Mesopotamia and Egypt represent in the ancient world? It's just effortless plenty. You just have to sit there and let the money fall into your pocket, right? The Tanakh, like the Bible talks about that. Like the Bible in the book of Deuteronomy contrasts the land of the promised land that the Israelites are about to enter into and says, just know this land is not like the place that you came from Egypt. Because in Egypt, the water just flows onto the crops and that's it. You're actually gonna have to pray for rain once you get into this land. So Terah travels from this place, but he stops halfway through in the journey. He doesn't really follow through. Abraham's the one who follows through. Abraham's the one who takes a chance on a land that God will show him. It's an entrepreneurial move. Abraham is the one who, when he gets down to Egypt, he comes up with a strategy for how to survive there. I mean, he's not just letting things happen to him. You could argue over whether his strategy was effective or appropriate. Nachmanides, the great medieval commentator, has lots of opinions about that, but he comes up with a strategy for how to survive in Egypt by pretending Sarah is his sister. He takes a chance in fighting against a more powerful enemy in the war between the 4 and the 5 kings. And finally, what is his reward? His reward is wealth. We're told over and over again how wealthy Abraham is. So what are we supposed to learn from this? Is it just that having wealth is good and that's the end of it? I think the answer is you have to contrast Abraham with his nephew. His nephew Lot also becomes very wealthy. And there's this moment where Abraham and Lot, who've now both become wealthy, are sort of like splitting up the land of, like, the land that would eventually become Israel. And they're each deciding where they want to live. And Abraham basically says to Lot, look, you choose, like you figure out where you want to go. And Lot chooses the plains of Zoar, right, of Zoar. And the Bible describes that land. It says it's like Kigan Hashem. It's like the garden. It literally is like the Garden of Eden. So Lot takes the place in the land of Canaan that is most like Egypt, that is most like Mesopotamia. It's just easy, easy, easy. Abraham settles in the hill country. What is significant about that? Well, the answer is, economically, what we know about the hill country is that the only way to survive there is through your wits and reliance on God, because you need rain from God. The Bible emphasizes that over and over again. So what Abraham is teaching us is that on the one hand, what makes Abraham better than Lot? Lot's not an entrepreneur. His father Terah is not an entrepreneur. Abraham is an entrepreneur, and that's amazing. But what else Abraham teaches us is that in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to have incredible self-confidence. You have to have unparalleled drive. I remember talking to an early episode of my podcast, Catherine Boyle. She's now a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. She's the head of their American Dynamism portfolio. She's amazing. And Catherine actually compared the best entrepreneurs to biblical prophets. She's like, you just have to be willing to have everyone else in the world think you're insane. And you need that. The challenge is that if you have that, oftentimes you can start to think of yourself almost as a god. And what Abraham does is the exact opposite. Even as he's being deeply entrepreneurial and relentless in his pursuit of success, he both understands that all of his success ultimately comes from God, and the entire purpose of his success is to enable him to help others within his society. And that's ultimately the difference between the home that Abraham builds, which is one that's built on kindness and welcoming, and the home that Lot eventually settles into, which is Sodom and Gomorrah, which is like a house of horrors. So ultimately, the stories of wealth in the book of Genesis and in the Torah in general, I think are meant to teach us both that we should lean into that creative drive, that entrepreneurial drive that God puts in us from the very beginning of the Garden of Eden, and at the same time understand that all of our efforts are nothing without God, and the only purpose of our efforts is to help those who are similarly created in the divine image.
And he didn't just create wealth, he created generational wealth. Because if you look at Isaac, Jacob, Yitzhak, and Yaakov in the Torah, it says that not only were they wealthy, they might have even been more wealthy than Abraham. That spirit or that blessing was bestowed on his children, his children's children, all through the line.
Yeah. Generational wealth is an interesting thing, right? I think we, as just like common sense human beings, have like dueling intuitions about it. On the one hand, we think of it as like when you think about, I think like inheritance taxes or wealth tax, right? Like death taxes. I think like a common sense person, just like their instinct rebels against that. Like, you're going to take I earn this money. I want to give it to my children. You're going to come in and take it for the government. Like, there's something about it that seems kind of gross. And at the same time, I think we also have like this common sense intuition that there's nothing worse than like a trust fund kid. Like, they're the worst, right? Because like you didn't earn this. You're just riding on your parents' coattails and whatever it is. And those two things are kind of in tension, right? So how do we square that circle? I think the answer is or at least an answer is, the reason the Bible doesn't begin with laws and instead it begins with a bunch of stories is because
I have ADD. That's why.
Yeah. If you began with Leviticus, there'd just be no Judaism. Like everyone would tune out, right? Like that'd be it. So like, why does it begin with these stories? Well, because these stories are crucial in shaping how we understand everything else that follows. So what's like the thrust of the book of Genesis? It's the idea of family continuity on the basis of values, or it's like how you grow a family through your values. Because on the one hand, the book of Genesis is all about families, right? And you could think of it as Adam and Eve leads to Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel and Seth. Cain and Seth eventually lead to Noah and his generation. Noah and his generation leads to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth lead to Abraham, and Abraham leads to Isaac, and Ishmael, which leads to Jacob and Esau, which leads to Joseph and his brothers. It's a story of children, but it's not the story of one family that grows linearly, because in every generation, somebody is rejected. Literally in every generation, whether it's Cain, whether it's Nahor, Abraham's brother, whether it's Ham, one of Noah's children, whether it's Ishmael, whether it's Esau, whether it's Joseph, right? And Joseph clearly assumes when he's in Egypt, why doesn't he contact his father once he's able to? Because he assumes that he's Esau. He assumes his father sent him away on purpose, right? Bible actually sets that up very, very clearly by using certain specific words. That's a whole different story. Basically, the whole story is one of family growth, but also rejection. What is the premise of the rejection? It's that belonging to a family just because you were lucky enough to win the genetic lottery isn't enough. You actually have to stand for something. And if you don't stand for something, you're imperiling the entire project. So if you think about it, of the children of Jacob, who are the inheritors of this incredible wealth that Abraham built, which of them becomes by far the wealthiest? Joseph, the one who's sent away, the one who's entrepreneurial, the one who actually builds something new, right? So I think what the Bible is setting up is that on the one hand, it is good to build the next generation. Like there's something beautiful about a parent enabling a child to have a better life than they do. And that's kind of a responsibility that a parent has towards a child, like leave the world better for my children than it was when my parents left it to me. And at the same time, children have this immense responsibility to their parents to validate those sacrifices and ennoble them by not just continuing those values, but by building on them better than they were before. And if you're not capable of that, then you will either find yourself out of the family line or made irrelevant to it. And the reason why Joseph succeeds is the ultimate test of that, because Joseph's success doesn't come from the fact that he inherits Jacob's fortune. It comes from the fact that he inherits Jacob's values, and it's those that he takes with him to Egypt and never lets go of. And because of that, he's able to succeed better than anyone.
So the problem with a trust fund baby is that there's no active transmission of value.
It's just a bank account.
Right.
It's not a set of values. It can come with, and meaning the responsibility of parent and child is to ensure that it comes with that. And if it does, by the way, then everybody wins, right? Because you think about the structures that are in place that enable a community like ours, like the, for lack of a better term, the frum community in America. So broadly speaking, kind of like Orthodox Jews. What has enabled the frum world to succeed? All these sorts of things that we just basically take for granted, like a yeshiva day school system, a series of social services that are unparalleled in any other American community in the United States, maybe with the exception of Mormons, of the LDS Church, right? Like, I can't really think of any other community that has anything comparable to what we have. It's wild, right? Like if your car breaks down on the side of the road, you can call someone and they'll be there. Shomrim will be there, right? Like we have our own ambulance services that anybody can use, not just Jews. We have schools, we have higher education, we have university higher education, we have yeshiva higher education. Like we have this massive infrastructure that has never existed since Mount Sinai. What enables us to do it? Wealth creation. Like just we as a community, we're the wealthiest Jewish community that ever lived in all of human history. People can critique that, and there are critiques about conspicuous consumption that are important. And I believe the term Gvir culture was coined on this podcast, right? So you can talk about all those things, and they are important. Those are important conversations to have. But at a baseline, if we simply take for granted the economic growth as a community that's allowed us to get to this point, we are throwing our entire family out with the bathtub, not just the baby. The ideal that we should strive for is one in which you have a community that is that is engaged in wealth creation deliberately, and isn't afraid of that and isn't ashamed of that, that actually sees it as a positive good, that insists on being creative participants in the economy. So we're not just, finance is very important, but we're not sequestering ourselves in certain sectors of the economy. We're going into all different sectors, whether it's finance, private equity, entrepreneurship, whether it's startup foundation, defense tech, agri-tech. We're going into all these different fields. Number two, we're creative members of the economy. Number three, we understand that all of this wealth creation is only for the purpose of allowing us to build a better community that best serves God and can serve as a model for anybody else looking to be godly. So all the wealth we're having is not to enable us to go on vacations or not to enable us to build, buy better cars and build bigger houses. Even though, again, we can talk about those things, what role they play in our lives, but the ultimate point of our wealth is to enable the entire community to flourish in a better way. So we should have an unbelievably philanthropic spirit, and we should expect that. And finally, understanding that wealth creation is an important means to an end, but it's still a means. And the end that we are striving for is a covenantal relationship with God that involves all of our fellow Jews, and ultimately that extends as a source of inspiration for all of humanity.
Hey there, Kosher Money listeners. We'll be right back to the episode. But first, we've got something exciting just in time for the holiday season. Twillory is launching their biggest sale of the year with up to 50% off site-wide. Yes, you heard that right. Half off on the shirts, pants, and jackets that will keep you looking sharp, all while staying comfortable and warm. Twillory's lineup has you covered, whether you're upgrading your work wardrobe, looking for the perfect gift, or just treating yourself because you deserve it. I have to mention I'm loving their vest. I'm not wearing it right now, but I'm going to be cracking it out for the season. It's the perfect layer for staying stylish in cooler weather and seriously, seriously comfortable. Plus, their dress shirts and polos have become my go-to. They're so, so comfortable. And here's a little something for being a Kosher Money listener. Use code CHAI, C-H-A-I, at checkout for an additional $18 off your first order at twillory.com/koshermoney. Link is in the show notes. But hurry, this sale is for a limited time only. You can mix and match. Don't miss out on the best prices of the year. Head over to twillory.com/koshermoney and get that closet ready for the holidays. Enjoy. There's always this viral video comes out once a year, The Secret to Jewish Wealth. And,
Yeah.
and it's described, and you laid out exactly why it's fundamentally flawed, but they describe a very simple reason as to how Jews attain wealth, and they keep it within themselves. And Jews only do business with Jews. And it sounds nice in the sense that it could be, but that's not really what you're laying out here.
I once spoke in Hong Kong for Shavuos, Holiday of Pentecost for those following along at home. But I once spoke in Hong Kong for Shavuos. And when I was there, I remember I got into the cab and I'm driving to the shul, to the synagogue. And the cab driver sees that sees my yarmulke, and he just starts talking to me. He's like, man, I love Jews. I'm like, lay it on me. I'm here for this. He goes, you guys own the media. You guys own the banks. You guys own the economy. You guys own Hollywood. And it's like usually that would be like an anti-Semitic stereotype, but it's like every one of those stereotypes. But he's like, I'm all in on this. Like, you guys are so genius. I love it. I'm here for it. Like, what's the secret? And the reality of it is that on the one hand, to the extent that people think that we own everything as in like some shadowy cabal, that's obviously nonsense. But, Jews have been doing business with each other successfully for a very long time. Why? For the same reason that anyone does business successfully with each other, which is trust. We have a really high degree of trust with each other, right? So like in the ancient world, the Greeks, for example, and you see this in the Gemara, in the Talmud, right? The old system of how to do business was like, you couldn't, if you needed to know whether you could trust somebody, you couldn't do a credit score check, right? You would need to trust their oath, right? That's why oaths are so important. And that's why in the Torah, that's why in the Bible, oaths are absolutely important, because you can't have an economy without oaths, without being able to trust that somebody is going to do what they say. So what enabled Jews to be really successful? We trusted each other. Why do we trust each other? Because we share values, we share a vision for the world, we share a mission, and ultimately we're a family. And we think of each other as a family, as a nation. And the lesson there, I think, for anybody who sees our success and wants a piece of it there's not like some secret like Jew juice that we like put in the water, right? We don't have, cabal meetings where we decide what the interest rate's going to be for the next quarter. At least I haven't been invited to them.
Notice he didn't say the weather, but
yeah. Well, the weather we do control, but we're not like doing it in meetings. It's just that we've built a really thick system of values that we all buy into and we all trust, and it gives us that ability to trust each other. So if you're a community, if you're a society, if you're a nation that wants to build something using us as a model, it would be to invest in moral education. It would be to invest in a sense of belonging and peoplehood. And that peoplehood can be ethnic, or it can be on the basis of an idea like you have in America, or it can be on the basis of peoplehood and belonging like you have in other parts of America, right? But have a sense of moral education, have a sense of high trust, have a sense of ritual, have a sense of belonging together. And if you have that, you'll have the kind of high trust that allows the kind of success that we experience.
Growing up, when we heard and saw holy people, they generally didn't have a lot of money. And you know what? Had they had a lot of money, I think we would have assumed them to be less holy. Where did that come from? Because I've been sitting for about a half hour. You've described our forefathers in a positive way, but also laden with wealth. At what point in history did this change, or is that just a misconception on my part?
No, I mean, listen, you have so many allusions to this already in Tanakh and the Bible. So like, Oev kesef lo yispa kesef, right? One who loves money will never be satisfied with money. That's not a valorization of poverty, but it is a sense of like, money isn't everything. And to the extent you think it is, there's something wrong with you. What do we admire about about poverty? I think if you break it down, because there is, I think you're right. Like when I think of people that I have just tremendous admiration for, whether they be people that I met or that were alive during my lifetime, or figures of the past that we all look up to.
Wooden rackety chair. That's what you're thinking they're sitting on, right?
Exactly.
They're not sitting on a couch. They had the same table for the last 35 years.
It's always someone riding on a donkey.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's people going into the lowest parts of society and whatever. So you think of some of the great stories. It's important to break down, like, what do we admire? I think what we admire is not the poverty. I think what we admire is the sacrifice. I think what we admire is the ability to hold firm to a value system and a mission statement and a sense of godliness despite the circumstances that you're in. So in some ways, it's the story of Job. It's the story of Eov, right? Yeah, it's easy, says Satan, to be a servant of God when you have everything. But when you have nothing, what's left? You'll have explicit statements in some of the Musar literature. You'll have explicit statements amongst some of the medieval commentators, and even have hints of this in the Talmud, where you'll see that wealth is corrupting, and it is. Like, it can be. Of course, we know it can be. That wealth can be corrupting, and materialism. The dangers of materialism and material wealth. If you think of Deuteronomy, right? Like the book of Deuteronomy tells us in sort of the song at the end of Moses' lifetime, the very end of Moses' life, we're told, what's the signal challenge that the Israelites are going to face? Vayishman Yishurun Vayivat, Shamanta Avisa Kasisa, Vayitol Shalo Aso, Vayinabel Tsarishu Aso, that the people of Israel will become fat, and they'll become disgusting and bloated, and they'll forget God, right? So there is a real challenge to materialism. So when we see people who manage to remain connected to God despite their circumstances, it's important for us to remember what we admire and are happy about are not the circumstances. The easiest way to see that is think about how many times, if the circumstances were what we admired, we would say a prayer every day and wishing those circumstances upon ourselves and our loved ones. And we don't. We do the opposite, right? What we admire is the perseverance, the steadfastness, despite those circumstances. And so to the extent that we want to take a value away from those stories and from those people who are our role models and should be, what we want to learn from them is their sense of sacrifice. So what's a modern takeaway from that? I mean, an easy one is Chabad, right? What kind of person just decides, I'm going to go live in Sri Lanka for years because a Jew might come through and he might need something? Or I'm going to spend my life walking around street corners, wrapping up passing Jews in tefillin and probably getting yelled at by, all those sorts of people who don't want to be wrapped up, right? What does it take to do that? It just takes a sense of sacrifice. It takes a sense of mission drivenness, of purpose drivenness. That's the thing that we admire. And we admire those, whether it's mission drivenness in the face of poverty, whether it's mission drivenness in the face of ridicule, whether it's mission drivenness in the face of a dominant culture that doesn't value those things. But what makes us special as a people, or at least what we hope will make us special as people, what we aspire to, is to be countercultural in that respect and to sacrifice.
Do you think part of the reason the holiest of the holy have moved away from looking to attain wealth was because over time, throughout history, money has had more and more of a negative connotation? Because nothing you described in Genesis so far, maybe people misused it, but it didn't have a negative connotation, or at least the way we look at society now. And when someone's laden with wealth, we don't always say, that's so we look negatively on money. Is that part of the reason?
I think you already have in the Bible, and there are even places where it's there, we just don't recognize it because it's not explicit. You have plenty of places in the Bible where it's clear that money is a problem, not because wealth is a problem, but because class division is a problem. What do I mean by that? For example, when the book of Deuteronomy tells us about making a Jewish king, the interesting thing about the book of Deuteronomy is that it doesn't tell us anything that a king is supposed to do. It only tells us things that a king's not allowed to do. So you're not allowed to have too many wives, and you're not allowed to bring the people back to Egypt, etc. What's one of the requirements? Not allowed to have too many horses. What does that have to do with anything? So, you could think of it as like, that's just another way of saying don't have too much money. Like, don't have too many possessions. That's actually not what it is at all. What it is what is a king responsible for that nobody else is responsible for? Military. The book of Samuel will tell us that explicitly. The whole reason the Israelites ask for a king, and the entire function of the king once they get the king, is to be the general, the commander-in-chief. Therefore, why is a king not supposed to have horses? Because in ancient militaries, the most powerful people in the army were the cavalry, were people who were riding atop horses. Why? Well, first of all, because it's incredibly effective. But what is the result of that? The result of that is that if you wanted to be an elite soldier, you need to have a horse. Buying a horse, and especially having to buy multiple ones in case one got killed, it's extremely expensive. So what ends up happening in these ancient militaries is the equestrian classes, right? The people who would ride horses became an elite in society, and they became noblemen and aristocrats, all because they were cavalry members, right? And what Deuteronomy is telling us is that actually in the army of God, in Israel's army, there are no class divisions. There's no cavalry. In fact, if you look throughout the Bible, you won't see cavalry on the Israelite side. You'll see lots of other things. You'll see them fighting cavalry, but chariots and cavalry, that's what the Egyptians have. It's what the Canaanites have. It's what the Moabites have. Jews don't use chariots and horses. Why? Because the Israelite army is an army of equals. And Adayom Hazeh, even until today, you look at one of the most remarkable things about Israel's current army, the IDF, is it has this culture of every single person is ready to take over. If their commander is God forbid something happens to their commander, each one is ready to take over. And so why is that important? Because there is this vision that the Bible has, and I've tried to lay it out, of what our people can contribute to the world. And that's creativity, it's entrepreneurship, it's wealth creation. And at the same time, there's a sense that what's the point of doing all of that? Why do we want wealth? So that we can understand that it comes from God and it increases our sense of dependence, and so that we can use it to make our society better, to alleviate poverty, to make sure that everybody has a life of dignity and purpose. But even beyond that, because the entire point of why wealth creation is good is not to satisfy some sense of human ambition, right? Or to satisfy some drive to power. The whole point of wealth creation, or of being creative and adding to the world, is because each of us is created in the image of God. It's precisely because all of us are equal that we have that responsibility, not because all of us are unequal, which is what you usually hear in popular visions of this. So if that's the case, if the whole justification for the good of economic growth and wealth creation and entrepreneurship is precisely the argument for human equality, all in the image of God, then we can't use wealth creation to create a society in which we're going to become unequal. And so that's why the Bible in so many different ways goes above and beyond to explain that one of the great dangers that our society can have, that a Jewish society can have, or a general society can have, is to allow those kinds of class divisions to creep in, where some people are just understood to be better than others. And so, to the extent that we as a community have a challenge with wealth, it's not in the fact that we think wealth is good and in truth wealth is not good. Wealth creation is good. Creativity is good. Economic growth is good. Entrepreneurship is good. It's when we assign greater moral value as people to the people who have than to the people who don't have. It's because that's precisely misunderstanding the whole reason that we think economic growth is good. If we think that some people are simply better because they're rich, then our souls are rotting, and we have to examine something within ourselves.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, when you look at all these school dinners and who the honorees are, they generally are the wealthy. And I think, and who am I, but in some ways it does seem correct, because there's a level of appreciation they have for a donation, some contribution that the wealthy have given to the institution. But I think there's a little bit of what you're describing in this misaligned focus as to why we're maybe honoring him because of his wealth.
That's right. And I'm the kind of person who I'm very contrarian. Like, every time people are like, we focus too much on wealth, I'm like, we so take for granted all the good things that we wouldn't have if not for the wealth creation of our community. Like, we think the alternative to the community we have now is where we have all the exact same amenities. We just are doing a little bit less conspicuous consumption. That's not the alternative. The alternative is like early 1900s America, where we have none of the institutions that we have now, and assimilation is sky high. Like, that's the alternative. That said, I think that while we should be unbelievably proud of what we've built as a community, all the institutions, all the kindness that we do, all of the thick relationships that we have with each other, that would be the envy of any other sub-community in America, literally would be the envy. At the same time, our sense of self-critique should be that directionally, we want to make sure we're always heading in the right trajectory. So, is it okay to honor, is it even laudable to honor, at a dinner, at a communal function, at a gala, or whatever it is it good to honor people who have contributed to the community through wealth creation and through philanthropy? Of course, it is good. We should do that. We should recognize that. Do we sometimes fail in not recognizing other contributions?
Yes.
Yes. And sometimes, and in many respects, greater contributions than, the whole point, if I'm right, the whole point of wealth creation is to do all the other things, and we don't recognize the other things, we failed. That's bad, right? So if the main honoree is always the gvir, or always the person who's given the most, then I think
we're the person we hope is going to
give the most. Right. Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
An aspirational honoree.
Exactly.
Right.
Then I think we failed. And I'll go even further than that. Where have we failed? The justification will often be, well, if the wealthy people aren't going to be the center of attention, then they're not going to give as much, or not going to want to come. And I understand the tactics and the strategies behind that. I do. At the same time, I think what we should do is there almost needs to be kind of like that social contract with wealth creators, which is, we will lionize what you're doing. And on principled grounds, we think it's a good thing, but we also expect you to carry out the mission and the vision that the Torah lays out for what wealth creation is all about, by specifically valuing all the other things. Meaning it should be the kind of thing, in an ideal situation, we should expect those kinds of honorees at a dinner. The expectation should be, we're going to ask you to be honored, and you're going to tell us, I'm glad to be honored, I'm glad to help the school, but here are the other people that I want to be honored also. Here are the people that I insist should be honored along with me. Like, that should be the norm that we expect. How we get there, I understand there are a lot of practical and tactical things involved in that, and it's not always so simple. But if we're talking about, what's the ideal state we should be moving towards, that's the ideal state.
Yeah, and a special shout out to the people that do donate and push away all COVID. And there's so many people, but we just never hear about them, right?
It's like Larry David, I didn't know I could be anonymous and tell everybody who I am.
We'll be right back to this week's episode. But first, imagine being a child trying to focus on school or a play, but all you can think about is, will there be dinner tonight? And now imagine that stress compounded by the fear and uncertainty of war. For too many children in Israel, this is their daily reality. The anxiety of food insecurity, combined with the turmoil of conflict, robs them of the stability they deserve. They're children, for heaven's sake. But Colel Chabad is stepping in. They are Israel's oldest charity, and they are ensuring children have consistent access to nutritious food, even during times like this. When food security is in place, everything changes for the children. They can focus in school, build confidence, engage with their friends, and stress goes down. Self-esteem goes up. They thrive emotionally, mentally, academically, in all ways. Colel Chabad isn't just providing meals. They're providing hope, stability, and a sense of safety when it's needed most. You can be a part of this life-changing mission with just a few dollars or a lot. Visit kohelchabad.org/kosher money. Give the families the security they need and the children the futures they deserve. That's kohelchabad.org/kosher money. No dollar amount is too little or too high. Give, give, give. This money goes to an amazing place. I've seen it firsthand. I've been to their pantries in Israel. I see pictures, emails, videos all day and night. They are assisting because of people like you. Thank you. And now back to this week's episode. Okay, so we have more to cover, lots more. But I want to ask you, when you peer into this big book of ours and you look at money and happiness, what lessons come to mind? Can money buy happiness? From a biblical standpoint, what do you see? Because I know America has their own takes on things.
The Beatles famously say, "Can't buy me love," and that's true. I guess it really comes to, at the end of the day, like, what do we value? Here, I'll tell you a story. My grandfather, I mentioned him a couple times already. My grandfather, Rabbi Lamm, was a hero of mine. You know, if you ask me, is the greatest American Jewish orator who ever lived.
Unbiased.
Totally unbiased. Totally unbiased. But I mean, truly,
you only found out he was related last week.
Exactly.
So you know that.
Exactly. Right? One of the great theologians, a Talmud Chacham, an absolute first-rank scholar, really builder of Jewish institutions, and a well-known, communal rabbi in his time. You talk about somebody like that, and it's like whenever people call me like Rabbi Lamm, it's always weird because I'm like the knockoff like Fendi bag that you get in like Singapore, right?
Yeah.
So
functional, but not.
I can get the job done, but I'm not. But like the logo's a little bit off,
Yeah.
You think about like, what do you admire about a person like that? Oh, the Yechidus with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he met this person and that person and this. The most incredible thing he ever did, if you ask me, again, ani hakatan, like I'm a nobody, but there's a letter that he wrote. My father actually has the handwritten copy, I believe. He was a rabbi at the Jewish Center in Manhattan, and there was a young girl in the congregation who was deaf. And, I think she had a hard time making friends, but when she came to shul, when she came to synagogue, like that was her time of week. Like it was the best time of her week. She loved groups and she loved the youth services, all that kind of stuff. And one week, my grandfather noticed that she wasn't there. And then he noticed the next week that she wasn't there. And the third week he noticed she wasn't there, he called her parents. First of all, the fact that he noticed one kid who wasn't there is already unbelievable. But when he called her parents, he found out that the reason she hadn't shown up is because she had a pet bird. And that pet bird was the light of her life, and it died. And she was so distraught that she didn't go to shul for 3 weeks in a row. Normally when you hear a story like this, like my expectations, and he called her and they had a beautiful conversation. He wrote her like a 4-page handwritten letter that was a hesped, a eulogy for her bird, by hand. And it's one of the most magnificent things you'll ever read. It's beautiful, and it's not talking down to her. It's sophisticated, and it's beautiful. It's so beautiful, in fact, that a friend of mine who lost someone very dear to him recently actually distributed copies of it at the Levaya, or rather at the Shiva, at the morning, post-funeral mourning. And to me, of all the things, a person like that does in a career, like, you always hear the Rebbe stories, like all the amazing things a person like that did, all the accomplishments in Torah, all the leadership, all the institutions. At the end of the day, all the accolades mean nothing compared to a young girl who's in mourning over something special that she lost, that maybe in the grand scheme of things we think isn't important, but was important to her. And in recognizing that and in taking the time out from everything else you're doing to write that letter, it's more important than everything else combined. So in the end, while I've spent a lot of time on this episode talking about how important I think creativity, the commercial life, wealth creation, economic growth, entrepreneurship is, and I value those things very deeply. And I think all things considered, we should value those things more healthfully, but also more than we do. At the same time, it's like undeniable that among the virtues, those that are most laudable are the ones that are quiet, that no one will ever see, other than by happenstance, and that bring two human beings closer to each other under God in a way that you simply can't do with anything other than just personal fear of God and awe of God and humility.
As you were talking, I was reminded of a story I heard this morning from Rabbi Daniel Kalish, who's sitting Shiva for his father, Rabbi Yeshua Kalish, and someone shared the story that Rabbi Daniel quoted this morning, and he said that there was this girl who was drafted and voluntarily perhaps into the Israeli army, and some of the families were bashing her and saying it's not the place for a Jewish girl, and Rabbi Yeshua Kalish saw this girl, went over to her and said, "We're so proud of you for helping take care of your family, like for Klal Yisrael. You're helping the Jews, and thank you, and we're proud of you." And that girl now has an Orthodox Jewish family. Her husband's in Colel and learning, and it was that one message that someone took of their time, a gadol, and said to somebody, "We care about you. We're proud of you." And like that effect, reminded me of this.
I'll tell you,
pet bird.
It in a funny way, like it makes me think so. But a year ago, so remember the basketball player Enes Kanter? He was on the Knicks for a little bit.
Yes.
Anyway, so he's amazing. So Enes is a good friend. And we went to Israel together. I took him to Israel. And while we were there, I mean, Enes is like a Turkish dissident. I mean, he's a very brave person.
Oh, he spoke out.
Yeah,
Right,
very
yeah.
much so. So while we were there, I wanted him to meet someone who could kind of be a role model. So we had him meet Natan Sharansky, and we met in Jerusalem and we're having dinner together. And at the end, I wanted to take a picture. And so Enes Kanter is, I believe, 6'9". And Natan Sharansky is not 6'9". And he's a tiny human being. And so they're standing next to each other, and it's just that you could barely fit them in frame together. Like, thank God for iPhones, because you had a vertical shot. Like, it was hilarious. And so like I turned to Enes, I'm like, listen, in the US we measure things in inches, and in Europe you measure things in centimeters, and in Israel we measure things in Sharanskys, and you're 2.5 Sharanskys tall. And it really, like, it's, by the funny thing was, after that, so Enes was hosting a basketball camp in Israel, which we set up with him, and Sharansky was I think involved in some sort of chess tournament at the time. Either way, chess somehow came up. And he said to Enes, so Enes said, like, why don't you come to our basketball thing? He said, I'd love to come. Why don't you come play chess with us? And Enes is like, oh, you play chess? Like, Sharansky's famously incredible at chess because he learned, like, as a Soviet political prisoner. So Enes says, I'm actually pretty good at chess. And without batting an eyelash, Sharansky goes, you're not gulag good, which is amazing. But anyway, the reason I mentioned the story is, like, we measure things differently. And there are all sorts of measures of wealth that you could use. There's at the national level, you could think of GDP, you could think of net worth, you could think of a stock portfolio, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, we measure wealth in a way that doesn't ignore those things. It takes them into account, just like it takes every measure of human accomplishment into account. But ultimately, we measure things in terms of closeness to God and the improvement of his world on our way to the Mashiach, to the Messiah. So that's ultimately the real measure we're going for.
Okay, so a few rapid fire questions for you to wrap this up. Personally, given the knowledge that you have as it relates to the Bible, if you could be tested with either wealth or poverty, seeing the stories that you've seen, would you have a preference? What sounds scarier to you?
I once asked a Rebbe of mine in high school for a bracha, and he said, "My bracha to you is that you should marry rich." So I mean, personally, I'd rather be tested with wealth, but that's because I'm not as great as the people who would rather be tested with poverty. But to answer the question seriously,
because there is something about poverty that can also be dangerous spiritually and socially. I mean, there's a true test to that as well.
I think that we should, to the extent that we hope to be tested. Why would we hope to be tested? Because virtue untested is virtue untrue. And we want to know if we're for real. Ultimately, that's the book of Job, right? I guess my hope would be that we as a people would be virtuous enough to merit not having to be tested in that way. And, it's like I said before, we never daven for our fellow Jews to be blessed with poverty. We never pray for that. We pray for the opposite, right? That said, what do I wish? I wish for our community that we should have the kind of leaders who could pass that test or any other tests of privation with flying colors. I'm not that person, and most of us aren't, but we should merit to have those who are.
Sometimes there's a guest who I like to ask the following question to, and I think you fall into that bucket. When you go to Israel, what excites you? And I don't mean going to the Western Wall, and I'm sure that is exciting, but maybe it's a little bit of a lesser known. I mean, in the Bible, there's so many different locations. What comes to mind?
Such a good question. Okay. There's so many ways to answer that question, but I think one that sticks out to me is I recently went with some of the biggest fitness influencers in the world. They're all, content creators who do fitness stuff like weightlifting, CrossFit, that kind of thing.
I wasn't there.
I mean, I barely was there. It's so funny. We stayed with them in a hotel. Usually, like when I'm like if I'm ever on the road in Israel, I usually like to wake up early in the morning and go to the gym before davening because it's like that's the only time in the day when no one's going to be there. So I got there and these guys were there the second the gym opened in the morning with their shirts off, and they looked like cartoons with like 6-pack abs drawn on them. And I just turned around and just went back to my room and davened because ironically, they weren't using any of the weights that I would be using. They were curling like 90 pounds. All I wanted was like a 30, so, but when we were with them, so, one of the things we found out was that one of their favorite Bible stories was David versus Goliath. Why? Because they're warriors, right? These are athletes. I mean, ironically, they identified with David, but they all look like Goliath, right? But like, that was their favorite story. Now for us, we kind of like take for granted, like if you grew up, especially if you grew up but certainly if you grew up going to Israel regularly, you kind of take for granted that this book is like just the paper representation of the reality. And the reality is what we all think of when we think of it. For most people who've ever heard of this book, whether you're religious or not religious, Jewish or not Jewish, like if you've seen Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat and the Prince of Egypt, right? This is a book of stories and it doesn't bear any representation or any relationship to reality. So these guys, we took them to, and we shot some videos there that went mega viral. We took them to Emek Ha'elah, the Valley of Elah, which is where David fought Goliath. And remember, they stood in the spot where David fought Goliath, and they reached into the Nachal, into the river, and they picked up 5 smooth stones, and they're literally reading the verses from the Bible, and they're tearing up. And I remember thinking in that moment, it's so easy to take for granted how magical this place is because we think of it as our home, and it is. But in addition to it being our home, it is also the source for all of the greatest ideas that humanity has ever had. And it is the source of all the greatest blessings that have ever been bestowed upon humankind. And to see that history, that past, those blessings, that tradition become a reality for a person in real life who never thought it was even possible was so powerful. I'll never forget it as long as I live.
That's awesome. You have a podcast.
Yes, sir.
What is it? Tell people. We'll put a link to in the show notes. Tell us what it's called and what do you talk about?
Yeah, the show is called Good Faith Effort. We talk about the importance of understanding the Hebrew Bible, of understanding Tanakh for all the greatest conversations you could ever possibly have in society. It touches on everything from politics to philosophy to sports to the economy to acting to anything like that. We have super fun guests on. Some of them, some of them you've all heard of, like Rainn Wilson from The Office, Dwight from The Office. Some of them probably never heard of, like just nerdy professors that I love and that I want you to love too. I mentioned before the podcast, we've been on a hiatus, but we're coming back, which I'm really excited about. We have a bunch of awesome guests coming up. So we have a huge back catalog. Like we have I think well over 100 episodes.
Wow.
Get excited for the new ones.
Audio and video?
Audio and video. Yes,
good.
I've been assured.
Okay, good. We'll put the links in and subscribe. Very, very compelling stuff. If someone does have a question, wants to contact you, wants to learn more about the content creation, how do they find you? Where do they go?
DM me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Ari Lamm, ARILAMM.
Okay.
And DM me. My DMs are open.
DMs are open. Well, cannot thank you enough. This was phenomenal. And we've never done an episode like this, so I'm happy.
Let's go. I'm a big fan, so I'm super excited to be here.
Love it. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm. And that'll do it for this week's episode. What do we have cooking next? I'm happy that you asked. Our next episode is recorded. It's the financial starter pack every young adult needs to have, not in their back pocket, but their front pocket. It's going to be tremendously useful for teenagers, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and even people older, especially how you can help your children. People who want to know what they need to know about money. That is the phenomenal episode we've got coming your way. It's 64 minutes of straight fire. Congratulations to Ben NH 37 and Sam the Man 475. You each just won a $100 Amazon gift card. Ben and Sam, visit us at livinglechaim.com and we'll get those out to you. What was your favorite comment, quote in this week's episode? Drop it in on YouTube in the comment section and we'll pick two of you. Each of you will win a $100 Amazon gift card. And who doesn't want an Amazon gift card? Thank you to the sponsors of this week's episode. We had Twillory. I'm sporting their vest, pants, socks. Awesome. The Donors Fund. Sign up for your free account. The tax savings are there and all your donations in one place. Really cool product, sleek, and of course, Colel Chabad. Use the Donors Fund to make your donation on the Donors Fund platform. Check them all out in the links in the show notes, and we'll have the episode-specific links there as well. And I've told you 100 times, so here's the 101st time. If you would benefit from a financial advisor or speaking to somebody for free to help you budget, get out of debt, or anything else finance-related, do what you need to do. Visit the OU's livingsmarterjewish.org. They've helped thousands of people just like you. You'll make a free appointment, and the coaching is free as well. If you want to help us out big time because you are a good person, no matter what your mother says, I'm kidding, she loves you, visit Apple Podcasts or Spotify and rate us 5 stars. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you click like, comment. Even if you're not entering the contest, just comment. And that tells the magical algorithms that control the internet that the Kosher Money Podcast is awesome. Jews and non-Jews alike are raving and ranting about the Kosher Money Podcast. 5 stars. Let's go. If you have a guest suggestion, livinglechaim.com, hit us up there. This guest came from a guest suggestion, so you can change the world by using your fingers. Until next time, keep your money kosher. Peace.
Living L'chaim.